Hello, imperfect leaders. Evaluations. In every single profession, employees are evaluated. They are evaluated by their direct supervisors, or they're evaluated by a board of directors. Formal evaluations can be really difficult to navigate if there's no clear process or protocol established at the very beginning. A shared image of what success looks like is paramount. My guest today, Dr. Jennifer Cheatham, has incredible advice for school and district leaders about goal setting and reporting on progress. During her after-action review, she talks about something that's really important to me, the tackling of a major system of oppression, a district's code of conduct, or also known as discipline. It's a great episode full of incredible insights. Thanks for tuning in. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dr. Jennifer Cheatham is my guest. And with over 25 years of experience in the field of education in San Diego and Chicago and Madison, Wisconsin, she has served as a teacher leader, professional developer, central office leader, area superintendent, and superintendent. And in each of these roles, she has focused on a number of things, including cultivating strong teams, designing enduring systems, and strengthening routines for organizational learning, and all in the focus of making the lives of children better. And she's now a senior lecturer on education and the co-chair of the Public Education Leadership Project at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Cheatham, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's great to be here.
So Jen, what an honor to spend some time with you today. Now, a few months ago, I had the chance to speak with Max Silverman at the University of Washington Center for Educational Leadership. I'm sure you have crossed paths with Max, and we had gotten to know each other a little bit. We had a meal, and during our conversation, it was wide ranging, but we kept returning to this role of evaluations. And, leaders in every profession are interested in growth and, professional growth and the growth of those that they supervise. This is a huge topic, obviously, for educational leaders as well. And it wasn't a day or so later I came across your article, Can Superintendents' Evaluation Lead to Their Own Growth? And in the article, you point out the unintended consequences of a traditional school board process of evaluation, how often they occur, or often that they're unclear, both in the terms of what's being evaluated, in terms of timelines and things like that. And, just how even lowering 1 point could accelerate a superintendent's, departure. And so you reference the incredibly disturbing national trend when it comes to leader longevity, right? We're losing superintendents at alarming rates. And as one continues to read the article, she learns more about the shared process that you created with your board in Madison, Wisconsin, which included self-reflection. So I know those who are listening today are thinking, are you going to ask her a question or are you just going to talk? So here's my question. Now in your role at Harvard, you have an opportunity to advise and mentor superintendents. And so I wonder, would you take a moment and just describe the advice that you give them when it comes to the evaluation process?
Absolutely, Peter. The advice that I mostly pass on is advice that was given to me when I first became a superintendent and was seeking advice. And that was to keep your hands on the steering wheel of your evaluation process. Which seems like especially pertinent advice now, given that things are so precarious, and especially if you're leading for equity in today's climate. But that said, yes, evaluation processes do need to be designed to be protective, but they also need to be developmental, right? They should support our growth as leaders, and they ought to be relational. If done well, they can build stronger relationships between superintendents and their boards, superintendents and their teams, even superintendents and their communities. So there are a few lessons that I highlight in that article, which I'll just maybe quickly summarize. So the first one is that it's crucial to use every step of your evaluation process to help your board understand the breadth and the depth of the superintendent's job, right? Not just once, like in the beginning, but ongoingly. And that's because you need them to help you do your best work. And if they don't understand the job in relationship to the charge that they've given you, it's hard for them to do so. So from the competencies you choose that you're evaluated on, to the evidence that you may compile in alignment with those competencies, to the self-reflection you might submit to your board, in my mind, every step of that process ought to provide an opportunity to support your board in gaining a deeper understanding of the job and the conditions necessary to do the job well. So, number one, teach your board about the job that you do. Most of them did not run because they were interested in managing the superintendent, right? They ran on other subjects, so they do need to be supported in that process. The second thing is that evaluations often involve gaining feedback from direct reports and from stakeholders. I know I often, well, every year for years, used a survey tool for principals and direct reports. I think it's really crucial to build in reflective time to make sense of that 360 feedback. And that includes processing that feedback with others, but not necessarily processing it with your board. I don't think that's the group that you ought to be processing with. You don't, in my mind, want to hand over survey results to your board without having interpreted them, right? Really prepared to tell them what you think they mean, what the implications are for your leadership. So the opportunity to take stock of the positive feedback you'll hopefully get in a tool like that, but also the more challenging critical feedback is something you ought to do on your own, right? Kind of quiet reflection time. It might be something you do with a coach, right? Which can be really powerful and supportive. And it can be more powerful when you're processing it with the people who gave you the feedback, so you can better understand where it came from. So there's that. And then I would say, finally, it's important to diminish the public nature of the evaluation, right? It can be scary. I mean, superintendent evaluations are often, in the newspaper, publicly available for other people to read. And I think you can diminish the public nature of the evaluation by regularly communicating in multiple forms already what you're doing, with what results, and what you're learning along the way. Like the act of sharing what you're learning, it's pretty rare, I think, in leadership, but it builds public trust, it builds credibility, and it makes the evaluation kind of like a blip on the radar screen, right? It can also help if the board suddenly turns on you, meaning, right, there's already a narrative out there, and it increases the likelihood that your community will come to your defense.
Well, you're specifically also, I think, speaking to the fact that boards are not static, right? So they're dynamic, and so then all of a sudden, the people that hired you, 4 or 5 years down the road, there only may be two that remain, and so all of a sudden, individuals who now are running, who now are saying, "Well, I'm going to evaluate her." If you've been really intentional about speaking to what you've learned, what they've been evaluating you on, and being able to be very public with that, they have no choice but to understand as they enter the job that you've been really clear about what your goals have been.
No question. In fact, I would add that if you haven't already done this, that built into your contract ought to be some language about how the superintendent gets to design the evaluation process with the board, right? So that you have some say and therefore can build it so that it's protective, developmental, and relational.
That's really interesting. I don't think I've ever seen a contract that includes that. And it's so easy to do. Why? It costs them nothing to say, we're going to develop this collaboratively. Of course, They want somebody that they're going to partner with. That's really smart. I was thinking about your first rule or first piece of advice. And I can remember that when I first became superintendent, no one had advised me on just choose 3 items that you're working on. And so I had, 7 board members. They all had 3 goals that they wanted me to work on, and you're just chasing goals. And so it wasn't until year 2, I believe, that working with our school board association was, whoa, let's pull back and let's choose 3 things that we want him to work on. Of course, he's going to work on all these other areas, but what do you want to evaluate him on, and do that together?
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And I would tell you the second piece, and then I'll leave it to I'm really curious on your thoughts. Knowing that your board members don't always interpret information the same way. And so initially I produced a scorecard, sort of almost like a Baldrige sort of scorecard that compared myself to other districts and that kind of thing. And that served maybe 3 members of the board who really like to look at numbers. And then others on the board, the other 4 members, really preferred a narrative. So I had to learn over time to really make a sort of hybrid approach to sharing this information, not unlike you would do with your own students in a classroom or your own teachers in a building if you're a principal, and then your principals as a superintendent. We all sort of approach things differently, and making sure that you're making it in the most accessible way really will help you.
Yeah, I mean, the many work streams of the superintendency never go away, right? Like it's important, again, to teach your board about the multitude of work streams that exist, right? And you can only get better at some subset of those work streams in any given year, which goes to your point about the 3 goals idea. Yeah, I love that. And the combination of giving your board kind of hard data accompanied by a narrative so that they can see how you're interpreting, the results seems very wise.
Yeah. The last piece I was thinking about, the 360 initially, I also sort of just adopted a 360 without really considering what were the questions that were being asked. So I imagine as you advise others, it's be really thoughtful about what do you want feedback on? I mean, you clearly can't avoid areas that that you might be struggling in. That doesn't mean to craft a 360 to only give you good information, but
Right.
be really thoughtful about what it is you're asking, because you may not be getting exactly what you would hope to get out of a 360.
No question. I mean, ultimately, that 360 ought to be aligned with the competencies that you've agreed on with the board, and the subset of those competencies that are most related to the kind of feedback you can get from constituents. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension, the leader's learning work. And that's really like the mind of an organization's work. And inside that dimension is a term, serving as a lead learner. And I thought about this when I was reading your article on the lesson that you learned in terms of the power of vulnerability. How a lead learner, yes, learns alongside the people they lead. That's super important. You don't just send people to a training. You are there with them. And then more importantly, or equally important, is that a lead learner admits when she, he, or they make a mistake. And so I wonder, would you speak to the power of vulnerability? And if you're willing, would you also speak to the privilege that many of us enjoy, that we're able to deeply engage in personal reflection without fear of retribution?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In the piece, I mention how crucial it is to demonstrate vulnerability, albeit selectively, to gain trust, insight that's necessary to do the job well. And that can look a lot of different ways. I mention, I think in the article, that it can, at least for me, one of the things I like to do is bring together community leaders who I often saw as my colleagues, right? The mayor, the head of the United Way, the head of the Urban League, right? Like the kind of major community leaders to sometimes preview data that I was had concerns about. I would share problems of practice with them. I made myself extremely vulnerable, and often brought community leaders together who were sometimes in conflict with one another, right? So we could really talk honestly about my work, but our collective work. And it really built trust, right, among that group. It just became a really powerful body that I could almost bring together in an instant. Not scheduled meetings, like, hey, group, I need you now. Can we get together, right? And almost everybody would try to get themselves there. Really amazing. I felt like I owed our community this kind of relationship, right? Given that we served their children, right? That we employed so many of them. That given the health of the school system is crucial for the health of the community, right? I felt like I owed them that kind of relationship. And to your point about privilege, I fully understand that leading for racial equity as a white leader in a white dominant community like Madison, which is where I was leading, that even when deeply criticized, that I was going to be okay. The worst thing that would happen to me, at least I thought at the time, was that I would get a crappy article written about me or an unflattering picture of me in the paper, which they often like to do to
Yes,
women.
yeah, they do. Particularly if you're making a point, if you're going, now, the first thing I want to talk about, and then it's sort of, oh, look at her, she's chastising us, she's chastising us, she's
mean look on your face, or they like to catch you at the end of a really long day, Yeah, totally. But that's the worst that would happen to me, right? I would wake up the next morning and be like, okay, that sucked, but I'm still here. I still have my job, and I'm going to get after it the next day. But for the leaders leaders of color that I've worked with, female leaders of color, the risks are much steeper. So I understand why vulnerability can be harder.
That jumped out to me in your article because you specifically talked about an individual who said, I can't do that. And so to be vulnerable is a real privilege. Thank you for doing
I'm glad. Yeah, I mean, same. I've had friends who've been victims of character assassination, whose families have been threatened, who've lost their jobs without any warning, right? It can feel really unsafe. I mean, even for me, as a white leader, for years, I wouldn't open up my social media to anyone in the community because it felt a little unsafe. I don't know. It just did.
Yeah, I never joined Facebook.
Right? And I remember a friend of mine telling me, Jen, if you're going to be a leader there, you have to be able to live there, right? And if you can't, you have the choice to leave. But yeah, building trust requires vulnerability. But even so, even with all those risks, I think at the end of the day, selective vulnerability has more rewards, right? That outweigh some of those risks.
And we'll be right back. An Imperfect Leader is underwritten in part by the Waters Center for Systems Thinking. Founded by Jim and Faith Waters, the Waters Center for Systems Thinking is an organization dedicated to helping individuals and institutions design systems to help them make more thoughtful decisions. Check out the Waters Center for Systems Thinking at their website, waterscenterst.org. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership and After Action. And my guest is Dr. Jennifer Cheatham, a senior lecturer of education and co-chair of the Public Education Leadership Project at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, and then we discuss it. So Jen, what happened?
Oh gosh, are you ready for this, Peter?
I'm ready.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to my first days as superintendent in Madison, my first year or two. So I have to give a little context to start. When I started my superintendency in Madison, I did what new leaders do during their first months on the job. I listened and learned and built with our community a strategy for improving outcomes. And just so you know, again, this is backdrop. We focused our strategy on 3 big things: school improvement planning, professional learning about excellent teaching, and a set of 5 priorities for central office. The idea was that the district wouldn't be able to make progress for all students, Black students in particular, if we weren't more disciplined about decision-making, hence the school improvement planning, more aggressive about providing the resources schools needed to do their best work, hence the focus for central office, those 5 priority areas, and more attuned to excellent teaching and learning that's culturally responsive, right? Hence our focus on professional learning about excellent teaching. We made a lot of progress during those years, by the way, that I'm really proud of. So I'm going to put that now aside. That's the backdrop. The most courageous and challenging thing we did, however, despite all that work that was happening, was inspired by some questions and concerns that came from the school board. And they were about the district's code of conduct, the discipline policy that guided responses to student misbehavior. They, as board members, were seeing mostly expulsion recommendations coming through, right? Their cue, so to speak, and very disturbed by what they were seeing. Exclusionary practice, the use of suspensions and expulsions were being doled out to Black students, Black boys in particular, and students with disabilities at an alarming rate. So interestingly, when I did my entry process, I didn't really key into that as a big part of, of the challenges, opportunities, or strategy. It came a little bit later from the school board, which prompted me to dig into it a little bit more. And then I was starting to hear more concerns now expressed quite beautifully, honestly, and sadly, through students and teachers, union leaders, even principals, parents. It was really astounding and concerning to me. I also talked to student services team members in some depth. I mean, school counselors, social workers, nurses. It seemed like they had this unique insight because of their focus on student wholeness, right, and health. And they could maybe even more clearly see that these overly harsh discipline practices were part of a larger cultural problem that needed to be addressed. Interestingly, after exploring like what we had already been doing on that front with the team, especially that student services team, I felt actually quite confident that we had the capacity to continue to make change. They had already been working on positive behavior intervention and supports. They had already been working on a social emotional learning curriculum at the elementary level. They'd already been working on restorative justice at the secondary level. I mean, there was a lot already in play. And my thinking at the time was that this was going to be really more about bringing the policy in alignment with current practice, right? As opposed to using the policy to dramatically change practice.
So if I understand correctly, here you are, you've entered into the superintendency. You've really established collaboratively, I'm assuming, working with your board and with your leaders and with your community to establish what are the top 3 things that you're working on. And as you're doing this work, what sort of reveals itself is this need for a code of conduct, or to better understand how the district is approaching discipline for all intents and purposes. And so I can speak very much to the fact that similarly in a district, I think similar in size to Madison, in a majority white community, and here was our district story was we were 20% African American, and yet our out of school suspensions, 50% of our out of school suspensions were African American. Right. So I imagine, as you were talking about, you didn't use the word disproportionality because you recognize that most of the people listening, or many of the people listening, may not know that word. So, but it was outrageously out of. Our ratios were out of whack, and so here, and you were recognizing here are these expulsion hearings and suspensions going on, and disproportionately impacting African American kids, which ultimately means if children are in school, they're not learning and they're not achieving, and it's just a perpetual cycle of underachievement that you definitely wanted to have an impact on. And it sounds like, as you were approaching it from a policy standpoint, if we just align some of these things will work out. And so, am I capturing that?
You are really capturing it well.
Okay. Excellent. So the next question typically is, what got overlooked? And so that's maybe a nice entry point into, what do you mean by policy and practice? It wasn't as simple as you thought it might be.
Okay. So, and I do need to say that not only were there some positive practices in play, but the data, while disproportionate, Peter, the suspension and expulsion rates were already coming down, right? Because of the slow and steady work that the district had already been doing. Even
so important to note. Yeah, it wasn't as if you were coming in saying, aren't you lucky I'm here, right? It was that there were some really intentional practices. Sometimes they are referred to as episodic, though, if they're not systemic. Right. So you have a very decentralized district, lots of really well-meaning and really committed individuals doing good work, but it's not part of a whole system. They're pockets of success.
Okay. Yeah. And, and ultimately, I won't get into the details here, but we did decide with unanimous support from the board to revise the code of conduct and codify a progressive and restorative approach to school discipline. And we also, by policy, committed to quarterly reviews of progress. Imagine that every quarter, a public review of how it was going, what the data was looking like, what we were learning, and what we would improve on as a result. Okay, so this is where I'm going to get into what we did or didn't do right. So I'll just be straight up honest that from day one, it ended up being a political battle that was much bigger than I anticipated. I mean, it really caught me off guard. Many in our community believe that the policy And it's gorgeous. I mean, you should read it, Peter. I mean, it's a very pretty policy.
Okay, I'm going to be honest. We have read it because we adopted so many of what you were doing in Madison.
Right?
It became a model for many districts around the nation, whether you knew it or not. And
It's
so
gorgeous.
we
Yeah.
we were really so I'm very interested to hear what got overlooked from your perspective, because we could almost do a dual after action review. I think similarly, I thought it would be just embraced, and I had no idea, even with the small pieces of definitions. What one school called disrespect was so different, markedly different from another district. So while we had policy, as we started to implement small things, we recognized, oh, there's now a really big backlash in terms of, oh, you just want children to be able to do whatever they want. They can curse out their teacher. No, there are consequences for cursing out your teacher.
Right.
And that may be defined as disrespect. It doesn't come with a 10-day suspension, though.
You got it. You got it. So it was interesting. I mean, there were lots of different perspectives, though. I mean, some people in our community didn't think the policy took us far enough, right? And they let us know. So, for example, there was, we still had police officers stationed at each of our high schools, and there was tremendous disproportionality in student arrests, meaning almost every single arrest, even though they had been coming down over time, were arrests of Black boys. Others believed we had gone too far and that schools were now less safe as a result. They pointed to increases in fights and gun incidents in a couple of our high schools. Some believed we had under-resourced the work and demanded more school-based staff to work with misbehaving students. Others thought we were spending too much money on it, right? Funding that would otherwise go to literacy or math instruction. And because it was a board policy, right? Because we led with board policy change, many of the battles took place in the boardroom, right? Documented regularly by the local news. What was hard, and I'm a mother of a Black boy. What was hard was the humanity of Black youth who were being most harmed, kind of hung in the balance, right? As we were having these debates in the boardroom. And while often unspoken, right, race and more specifically our attitudes about Black boys were at the center. In hindsight, can I talk about what I might have done differently?
Oh, please. So
Okay.
This is the portion of what got overlooked. So in hindsight.
So I'll just start by saying I have no doubt that this was the right work. Work that would benefit every student in our district, given our beliefs in student safety and belonging, right? We know that students have to feel safe and belong if they're going to thrive academically. So I think student discipline may not be the right way to talk about the work, right? It is ultimately about making sure that students are both physically and psychologically safe in their classrooms so that they can learn. I'm really proud that we stood by our values on that. What I wish I had done was I wish I had been much more politically astute. I learned a lot about political leadership. Now, I don't want anyone to get me wrong. There was a lot that I was doing in the political realm, and I think I'm generally a pretty strong political leader. We formed a community coalition. We met regularly to problem solve with the union. I attended community meetings. I worked with the editorial boards, right? On and on and on. But if I could rewind the clock, there are a few things I would have done differently. First, I would have taken time to diagnose the kind of problem we were facing, right? Like, what kind of problem is the issue of disproportionality in student discipline, right? Or excessive use of exclusionary practice. If I had done so, I think I would have seen that the problem of overuse of exclusionary discipline practice was not just this complicated problem, but a complex problem, a problem where the answer is unknown, a problem that's rooted in history, a problem that is easily influenced by the larger political climate, meaning if there's a school shooting somewhere, now everybody's going to have a different opinion on it. If there's something horrible happens to a Black boy by police, it'll have a different influence on the policy, right? It's very volatile because of the political climate, and you just can't create a 3-year plan and implement it.
I love the fact that you are distinguishing the difference between complicated and complex, right? Complicated is, it could be hard, but there's a right answer for the most
Right.
part. And complex is, there is none. And what I hear you saying is, what I could have done differently or what I overlooked was the fact that I inherited a system that was created hundreds of years before I even arrived, and that those systems, right? The system will generate its behavior, right? So, and so here we are. We have all of our children, particularly our children of color, who are being more often being suspended than others, and thinking that we might just be able to sort of, oh, where's our leverage point? Okay, we'll just flip that switch and we can make some changes. Yeah,
Right.
that's
And
really
it's in
interesting.
a kind of, white dominant community in a white dominated field at this point, right? To your point about systems and structures, like we haven't experienced even ourselves a different way of thinking about discipline.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So my thinking was I should have let solutions emerge. It needed to be top down to some degree, meaning it was important for the district to clearly define a problem and make a commitment to working on it and committing resources to working on the problem, right? That there had to be like kind of a quote unquote top down element. But the bottom up element was missing. We needed to create an approach that there would be room for people to play with solutions, to take risks.
You're really speaking to the thought that you make decisions with the people most impacted. And so
Yeah.
if you're asking teachers in particular to shift practice and to adopt a growth mindset in terms of our children and what they're capable of and how we will respond when a situation escalates, that
Yeah.
yes, there has to be top down sort of this is a non-negotiable for us in that we can do better. We're well resourced. We have the talent. We're intelligent enough. We're empathetic and compassionate people. We're a charitable community. Look at the United Way and the Urban League and all these people who will rally around this community, and maybe sort of having an idea of shifting the focus to, okay, so where can we at this level, at the teacher level, start to grow and emerge these interesting or promising practices that will shift the way that we believe. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
teachers in
really
partnership
interesting.
with students, in partnership with parents,
Yeah.
right? I think so. That was big. Another lesson that I learned, which is kind of along those lines, is I would have not only allowed the work to grow through school-based inquiry, right, and engagement in like a community practice on the subject, which is what we were just talking about, but I would not have started by pushing a big policy change because it brings with it enormous scrutiny. It's really hard to take risks and make mistakes under a public spotlight.
Also, I imagine, though, that there's, just to push back a little bit, it is in those initial years as a superintendent that you have permission to sort of push something pretty quickly with your board. And then you have to sometimes wait until you've been there for a long time before you can really change something as well. I don't know. Maybe you agree or disagree with that.
Not,
but this sense of urgency when we first arrive is sometimes what compels us to make these sort of sweeping decisions.
Well, yeah, there's no question. And I really wanted to give the board a big win and help them do something that they really wanted to do. I do also think that there is risk in putting things in the public spotlight that frequently, because remember, we were doing quarterly reviews. So maybe that was part of the big flaw, putting in the spotlight that frequently. But it would also allowed, it made it too easy for a negative narrative about either our young people, Black boys in particular, or a negative narrative about our teachers and their unwillingness to take up the work, to take life, right? Like, so this negative narrative about both teachers and children, that was like a risk that I really regret taking. I think I might have, instead of going all in on a huge policy change, codified smaller, high impact policy changes over time so we could prove change in practice was working, right? And then make adjustments to the policy. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. I imagine as you're advising superintendents around the country through your program, that there are opportunities for them to instruct their board about the complexities of the superintendency, as you noted in our first segment. And then how do you maybe take smaller chunks and bring them along so that they're comfortable, that the community can digest the shift in practice that's happening at a district level. I wonder, would you mind talking just a little bit about what you learned about relationships or what new relationships form? Because I imagine while we're sort of deconstructing this and looking at what got overlooked, there's a really positive piece here about what you learned about relationships and certainly the end products.
Yeah. But I think the most powerful thing was how this was one example of an opportunity where we could really work across institutions in the city. I mean, it really strengthened, and this kind of goes back to our conversation about vulnerability. I mean, we were having new kinds of conversations about the health and wellness of Black residents in Madison, right? Prompted by this work, or deepened by this work across entities. And again, this is the mayor's office. This is the chief of police.
I was thinking the health department. I was thinking housing authority. I was thinking, I mean, if you're talking about changing practice, so an individual is released from prison, doesn't know where they're going to live, moves in with grandma because grandma says, of course you can come live with me. Yeah. And then the housing authority has a policy that says, oh no convicted felons can live in your place. So now grandma, you're out. And grandma says, well, where was I supposed to send him? What was I supposed to do? That's my family. And so thinking about practices in terms of how policies have been established, maybe with good intentions, but with terrible ramifications.
It's amazing, right? Like the juvenile justices we were talking to in ways that we had not talked to, and worked with before. Like everybody, the 100 Black men of Madison, like we were all in it together, NAACP. And in fact, I can remember one meeting where we worked with American Family Insurance, who had like an innovation arm where they were trying to.
Shame on them for their theme song, because it's always in my head. American Family Insurance. They better give me some money for that. You now are sponsoring it.
Well, they had an arm of the organization that worked on social justice issues. And so they started to support us by exploring deeply the problems. And one time we did a simulation of what happens when a middle school kid gets arrested for car theft, which was a problem at the happening in the community at the time. And we watched step by step what would happen to a young person from the time that they were arrested, right? It was so eye-opening. We could see all of our shared responsibility for this young person. And those conversations, I tell you, would not have happened if it weren't for the fact that we were trying, not just as a school district, but as a community, to do this work together.
So you have just answered that last question. In the end, what was something that was good that came out of this situation? And it sounds like what you've done is spotlighted for an entire community, because systems are about interconnectedness. So the schools reside within the system of Madison in your case, and that now individual systems, in their own organizations, were beginning to understand and reevaluate their own practices. How cool. How cool.
And it wasn't just that we were seeing up close the problems, but that we were together getting a more deep understanding of the hopes, desires, needs of Black youth if they were going to thrive. We became more attuned to their humanity. And that's a really beautiful thing.
My guest again was Dr. Jennifer Cheatham, a senior lecturer on education and the co-chair of the Public Education Leadership Project, the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Jen, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today. It is so clear that you lead with a profound moral focus and a clear, compelling purpose. And we are so lucky to have you advising and coaching so many future leaders. The field of education, I believe, needs leaders who lead, as you noted, empathy and compassion, creativity, you use the word courage, and through highly collaborative structures. And that includes a desire to model vulnerability. And in so many ways, you modeled that here today. And so for that, I am so very thankful. Thank you so much for being on An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you, Peter. It was a real privilege.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader: Leadership in After Action.